Today we're going to be tying the smallmouth slayer. After starting your thread base, snip the tag end and we're going to attach the dumbbell eyes. We are going to use figure 8 thread wraps to attach the eyes. To do this, you are going to go over one side of the eye and then under the shank, then to the other side of the eye. Do this about half a dozen times. Then, to pull it tight, we are going to make wraps over the shank but under the eyes. This will pull the figure 8 wraps tight and hold the eyes in place. Now advance your thread back towards the bend of the hook. Now we're going to take some UV resin, either flow or thin, and we're just going to coat the threads around the eye. This is just going to help hold them in place. Now just hit it with your UV light to cure everything up. Now we're going to tie in a clump of marabou. Normally we would make the length of the tail the same length as the shank, but for this pattern it's about 1/4 of the shank. Pinch the marabou tight to the shank, then make a loose thread wrap, followed by checking to make sure the marabou is still orientated correctly. Then you can pull it tight and then finish tying in the rest of the marabou, stopping about halfway up the shank before cutting the tag end off. When you go to tie in the belly material, you want the long fibers facing the shank. This is because when you fold it back forward, it will have the fibers facing the outside of the fly. You'll see this at the end of the tie. Start by tying it in behind the dumbbell eyes, and then advancing your thread back towards the marabou tail. Alright, now we're just going to make a small dubbing brush, because we're only going to make a couple wraps before stopping. Now just make 3 or 4 wraps. Now we are going to tie in our crawfish eyes. After making a couple thread wraps to hold them in place, I will cut the plastic stem. Then I will reposition them where I want. Once I have them in place, I'll continue making thread wraps. Now you can cut the stems before the dumbbell eyes. Then advance your thread back over the cut ends. Bring your thread back down to where you stopped making wraps with your dubbing noodle. With this dubbing noodle, you're only going to have to make about 2 wraps around the shank, so you don't have to make it super long. Make your 2 or 3 wraps and stop again. Now we're going to simply tie in our clear mono and having it stick out the back. We are going to center tie in the rubber legs. To do so, simply wrap the rubber legs around the thread. Then pull them up and tie them in on top of the shank, making wraps back down towards the bend of the hook. Now we can make a longer dubbing noodle. This time we are going to make connecting wraps all the way up the shank until we reach the dumbbell eyes. Don't worry if you make it all the way up behind the eyes with just one dubbing noodle. If you have to stop and make a second one, do so. If you feel the need, trim up some of the dubbing. If not, it's perfectly fine if you leave it shaggy. Next, you are going to cut the fur off the hide of the zocker strip. Make sure you are ready to tie it in as soon as you cut it. Make one thread wrap to hold the fur in place. Now this next step I do a little different. When I trim it, I don't try to get as close to the thread as possible. I trim a straight line and then I pull the fur back and finish tying it in place. That way I know I have that cut end as close to the thread as possible and hidden behind the dumbbell eyes. After you make a few more wraps to lock in the fur, I make another small dubbing noodle just to hide the thread wraps and make everything neat behind the eye. Now it's time to finish the belly of the fly. Pull that flap forward, and now you notice because of the way we tied it in earlier, the fibers are all pointing outwards. During my first thread wrap, I pull on the belly, that way it's nice and tight for that first wrap. Now quickly check to make sure it's sitting as flat as possible, then finish tying it in with a couple more thread wraps. Now we're going to make evenly spaced wraps with our mono fishing line. I like my first 2 wraps to miss the rabbit strip fur. Then hold it down on the third wrap and start to capture it. Continue to make evenly spaced wraps until you reach the dumbbell eyes. Once you've reached the dumbbell eyes, simply tie in the mono fishing line. After it's all tied in, advance your thread in front of the dumbbell eyes. Make a couple thread wraps, and then throw in a quick whip finish. Now you can cut the thread, then cut the mono fishing line, and finally you can trim the belly material to length, just a little bit longer than the eye of the hook. Now all I have to do is hit the threads with a little bit of UV cure, hit it with the light, and you're good to go. Now's the time to do any last minute trimming.